It's a warm afternoon at Oakwood Park, the kind where the trees sway gently in the breeze and the sound of children playing fills the air. But today, something is different. In the distance, Jordan, a young black teenager, walks slowly down the park path, minding his business, when suddenly, a voice breaks the calm. Catherine, a middle-aged woman standing nearby, watches Jordan with suspicion. Her gaze is sharp, as if she's searching for something out of place. Without hesitation, she pulls out her phone, dialing the police. "There's a young man here causing trouble," she tells the operator, her voice rising with concern. The accusation seems thin, unfounded, yet it carries weight in her tone, and within moments, the park's peaceful atmosphere shifts. As Jordan tries to process what's happening, the distant sound of sirens grows louder. His heart races. This wasn't supposed to happen. With each passing second, the tension mounts, the situation spiraling toward an unpredictable moment. Jordan didn't expect this today, and neither did anyone else around. What happens next will change everything. It was a peaceful afternoon at Oakwood Park, a place where families often gathered, where the gentle rustle of the trees played a quiet melody in the background. Jordan, a 14-year-old African-American teenager, sat on a bench near the center of the park, his feet tapping lightly on the ground. His mother had asked him to wait there while she ran a quick errand. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows as the late afternoon stretched on. Children played nearby, their laughter echoing in the distance, while a couple walked their dog, enjoying the serene atmosphere. Jordan was content, lost in his own thoughts. He was just a kid, eager for the simplicity of the moment, his mind far from worries. A warm breeze brushed his face, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. It was just another ordinary day in a park that had seen it all: laughter, tears, and countless moments of peace. But not everyone shared in Jordan's sense of calm. Catherine, a woman in her late 40s, stood off to the side, her eyes scanning the park. She was a regular at Oakwood Park, and today, something about the sight of Jordan resting on the bench unsettled her. His presence, though unremarkable to most, stirred something in her. Her gaze shifted between him and the people around them, her mind spinning a narrative of suspicion that wasn't grounded in any real evidence. She had seen teens like him before, the kids who, in her eyes, didn't belong here. Catherine's posture tightened, her hand hovering near her phone. She had seen enough to feel concerned, even though nothing about Jordan's behavior suggested any danger. Her mind made up, she dialed the police. She didn't give them a chance to ask questions, launching into a rushed explanation of the situation. In her eyes, Jordan was a threat, simply because of who he was, where he was, and how he looked. Oakwood Park, a public space meant to welcome everyone, suddenly felt smaller, less welcoming. The shadows of the trees, once a comfort, now seemed to stretch longer as the tension in the air grew. The place that should have been an escape became a stage for an encounter none of the people around would forget. As Jordan sat on the bench, enjoying the warm sunlight, Catherine's footsteps grew louder. She approached him with purpose, her eyes narrowing as she took in his presence. The park, once a place of calm, now felt like a battleground. Jordan barely noticed her at first, but when she stopped in front of him, he looked up, sensing her gaze. "Hey, what are you doing here?" Catherine's voice was sharp, filled with an unspoken accusation. Her eyes swept over Jordan, scanning him like he was out of place in the very park he had visited countless times before. Jordan, startled by the sudden confrontation, stood up slowly, trying to remain calm. "I'm just waiting for my mom," he explained, his voice steady. "I'm not bothering anyone." But Catherine didn't hear him. Her mind had already decided what she thought. "You're loitering, causing trouble. You don't belong here," she said, her words cutting through the air. The weight of her accusation hung heavily between them, as if it were somehow the truth simply because she said it was. Jordan's heart began to race. He couldn't understand how this was happening, how, just by existing, he had become a problem in her eyes. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he repeated, his voice quieter now, trying to keep the situation from escalating. But Catherine wasn't listening. Her assumptions had taken root, and they were now her truth. She stepped back, pulling out her phone with swift movements, her fingers dialing 911 without hesitation. Jordan's stomach sank as he realized what was coming. He had seen it happen before. People like him, black teenagers, faced suspicion and judgment just for being in the wrong place. And now, he was the target. The phone call felt like it lasted forever. Catherine spoke to the dispatcher, her voice filled with authority, but also tinged with fear. "There's a suspicious young man here in Oakwood Park," she said, her words dripping with judgment. "He's acting strange. I think he might be causing trouble. I'm afraid he might hurt someone." Jordan's throat tightened. He knew how this could go. The police could arrive, and no matter how much he explained himself, no matter how innocent he was, the situation could turn in an instant. He was a teenager, alone in a park, and now a stranger had called for his arrest. The consequences of a police encounter, especially one where a black teenager was involved, weighed on his mind heavily. As Catherine spoke to the dispatcher, Jordan stood there, feeling a helplessness he couldn't shake. His body felt frozen, unsure of what would happen next. He had tried to stay calm, tried to avoid conflict, but it seemed like the assumptions made about him, just because of his skin color, had already set everything in motion. The park that once felt like a safe space now seemed too large, too open, as if it was closing in on him. The sharp sound of sirens split the air, making Jordan flinch. His stomach twisted as the unmistakable red and blue lights flickered through the trees of Oakwood Park. 2 police cars pulled up, their tires screeching against the pavement as they came to a halt. The officers stepped out, moving with a sense of authority, but the first glance they exchanged suggested uncertainty. They took in the scene, the young black teenager standing there, his hands at his sides, and Catherine, arms crossed, standing nearby, her face filled with expectation. It was clear they had already made up their minds about what was happening. Jordan's pulse quickened. His heart was pounding in his ears, but he tried to keep his breath steady. He had done nothing wrong. He was just a kid, caught in something far bigger than him. But the officers didn't seem to care about his side of the story. They looked at him first, then at Catherine, and then back at him, assessing with a level of suspicion that felt heavier than anything he had ever known. The first officer, a tall man with short-cropped hair, walked straight up to Jordan. "What's going on here?" he demanded. His tone was stern, and there was no sign of any doubt in his voice. "I was just waiting for my mom," Jordan said, trying to stay calm. He spoke clearly, hoping his voice would carry some weight in the face of the growing tension. "I haven't done anything wrong." But the officer didn't respond to his words. Instead, he glanced at his partner, a woman with sharp eyes, who stood back, her arms crossed, watching him like she was already certain of what she expected to see. The silence between them felt suffocating. The officer spoke again, his voice colder this time. "We need to see some identification." "How old are you?" "I'm 14, Jordan replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't have ID on him, he was just a kid, out for the day. But it didn't seem to matter to the officer. "Where's your ID?" the officer asked again, more forcefully this time. Jordan's throat tightened. He didn't carry one. He wasn't expected to at his age. But no one was asking about his age or his situation. They were focused on one thing, Catherine's account. "I don't have it," Jordan said, struggling to explain himself. "I'm just here waiting for my mom. Please, I didn't do anything wrong." The officer's eyes narrowed, and the words that followed felt like a dismissal. "We'll see about that," he muttered, glancing back at his partner. They didn't seem interested in hearing Jordan out. They were only interested in confirming what Catherine had already said. His presence in the park was enough to raise suspicion. The woman officer pulled out her notebook, flipping it open with a practiced motion. "And what exactly are you doing here?" she asked, the tone of her voice leaving no room for discussion. "I told you," Jordan said, his voice shaking now. "I'm just waiting for my mom." That's it. But it was clear that wasn't good enough. They weren't listening. The officers seemed to have made their minds up before they even arrived. Catherine's accusations weighed more heavily than the words of a young teenager. As the questioning continued, a few people from the park had started to gather around. They weren't stepping forward to help, but their phones were out, capturing everything. The unmistakable light from their cameras flashed in Jordan's face, only adding to the humiliation and discomfort. The pressure was unbearable. He could feel their eyes on him, the anxiety swelling inside him as his every move was now being recorded, perhaps for the world to see later. The fear of how this would be perceived, how it might be shared, made the entire moment feel even more suffocating. It wasn't just about the situation anymore, it was about how it would be seen by people who had no idea what he was going through. The officers didn't seem to care about the onlookers. They continued to question Jordan, but their focus was never on what he had to say. The crowd, silent but aware, began to form a barrier around them. And as Jordan stood there, helpless, it became clear that this was no longer a simple misunderstanding. It was a moment that, once captured, would echo far beyond the park and could easily spiral out of his control. As the officers continued to question Jordan, the sound of tires crunching against the gravel echoed through the park, signaling the arrival of an unexpected presence. A black SUV pulled up to the side, its engine rumbling to a stop. The officers didn't seem to notice at first, too focused on their interrogation, but Jordan could feel the shift in the air. The car door opened, and out stepped a woman who immediately commanded attention. Mayor Olivia Thompson, Jordan's mother. Tall, confident, her stride purposeful, she walked toward the scene with an air of authority that immediately drew the officers' gaze. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate as her presence made itself known. As soon as they saw her, the officers straightened, their posture adjusting in response to the weight of who they were facing. The skepticism they had shown Jordan just moments before vanished, replaced by something else, an almost automatic respect. Catherine, who had stood with crossed arms, watching with an air of satisfaction, now looked caught off guard. Her eyes widened as she processed the change in the situation. The shock on her face was impossible to miss. She had clearly expected Jordan to be just another nameless teenager in a park. But now, she was confronted with the reality that he was someone's son, someone who held power in the city. Mayor Thompson turned her gaze to the officers. "What's going on here?" Her voice was calm but carried authority, an undertone that made it clear she wasn't asking out of curiosity, she was demanding an explanation. The officers faltered for a moment, and the air around them grew thick with discomfort. "Ma'am," the male officer began, but his words faltered as he tried to explain the situation. "We received a call about—" "I know exactly what you received," Mayor Thompson interjected, her tone sharp but controlled. She turned to Jordan. "Is this true, baby? Have you done anything wrong?" Jordan shook his head, his relief almost palpable as his mother's familiar presence anchored him. "No, Mom. I didn't do anything." The officers shifted their weight, their discomfort clear as they now faced a higher level of scrutiny. The power dynamics had shifted instantly. Jordan, who had been seen as a threat, was suddenly not just a teenager, but the son of the mayor. The officers, once so certain in their actions, now had to face the reality of how they had treated him. Mayor Thompson's gaze never left the officers as she spoke, her words forcing them to confront their assumptions. "What were you thinking?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. "This young man was waiting for his mother, and you're treating him like a criminal. You better rethink what just happened here." The officers stood silent, the weight of her words sinking in. The tension in the air didn't completely lift, but it had shifted. The power of privilege had spoken, and in that moment, the line between suspicion and respect had been drawn. As Mayor Thompson stood tall, her gaze fixed on Catherine, the tension in the air became almost palpable. The mayor's voice, calm but firm, broke through the heavy silence. "Why did you see Jordan as a threat?" she asked, her words cutting through the layers of accusation. "What led you to believe that his mere presence in this park was a cause for concern?" The question was sharp, designed not just to probe Catherine's actions, but to expose the underlying assumptions that had sparked the conflict. It was a challenge, one that forced Catherine to confront the biases that had driven her to make such a hasty judgment. The crowd watched, breathless, as the mayor's words seemed to hang in the air, demanding an answer. Catherine shifted uncomfortably. Her eyes darted between the mayor and the crowd, but she couldn't avoid the question. The weight of it seemed to settle in her chest. I saw him sitting there, alone, and it didn't feel right, Catherine stammered, her voice faltering. He looked out of place. The mayor's expression softened slightly, but she didn't let up. What exactly about Jordan's presence made him seem out of place to you? Was it his age? His skin color? Or something else? For a moment, Catherine stood silent, her thoughts racing. The truth began to surface, but admitting it out loud was harder than she had imagined. She had allowed her own biases to cloud her judgment, but acknowledging that now felt like a personal defeat. I didn't mean to, she trailed off, her voice barely a whisper, the guilt starting to take hold. The officers, who had remained by the sidelines, exchanged uneasy glances. The discomfort was palpable. Their faces had shifted from authority to uncertainty, as if the reality of their own roles in the situation was beginning to sink in. Mayor Thompson watched them closely, her eyes steely. "This is the problem, isn't it?" she asked, turning to them. "The assumptions made based on something as superficial as skin color. We are all part of this system. We all need to recognize how deeply ingrained these biases are." The crowd began to murmur, the weight of the conversation settling over them. People shifted uncomfortably, some with their phones raised, others with their eyes glued to the scene unfolding before them. The mayor's challenge was not just to Catherine, but to every person watching, every person who had ever made a judgment based on preconceived notions. As the mayor's words sank in, Catherine looked down, struggling with the guilt that now clung to her. She hadn't fully understood the harm she had caused, but in this moment, the weight of her actions was becoming clearer. Yet, even as the realization began to dawn, she remained defensive, unable to fully grasp the extent of the damage she had done. The tension in the park was thick, and the air seemed to crackle with the discomfort of unspoken truths. The conversation had shifted from a simple accusation to a much larger conversation about bias and racial profiling, one that left everyone involved questioning their own judgments. As the crowd settled, Mayor Olivia Thompson stepped forward, her voice carrying through the park. The tense moments from earlier hung in the air, but now there was a shift, an opportunity for change. With authority, she addressed the gathered onlookers, her tone resolute yet hopeful. "We cannot ignore the biases that exist in our community," she began, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. "Today, I announce a new initiative aimed at addressing this very issue, a comprehensive anti-bias training program for our police force and all city employees." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement while others remained silent. "This is just the beginning of a larger conversation. We must do better, and we will." Her words resonated with many, but there was an undeniable undertone of uncertainty. While the announcement of training was a step in the right direction, the reality of eradicating deep-rooted bias was not so simple. The crowd's mixed reactions reflected this truth. Some felt a glimmer of hope, while others couldn't help but wonder if a training session would be enough to change a system built on years of prejudice. The moment shifted again as Catherine stepped forward. Her face was tight with discomfort, and she hesitated for a moment before speaking. She began, her voice lacking the conviction of someone truly sorry. "I apologize to Jordan, and to his family, for any distress I may have caused." Her apology felt rehearsed, lacking depth, as if she was going through the motions rather than acknowledging the harm she had done. The crowd's reaction was immediate, with some people exchanging glances, while others shook their heads. They could tell that Catherine's apology didn't come from a place of understanding. She was apologizing because she had to, not because she fully grasped the impact of her actions. Some in the crowd murmured in support of the mayor's stance, but there were others who remained skeptical, unsure if the words from Catherine would truly lead to change. Then, Jordan stepped up. His presence commanded attention, and though he was still a young teenager, there was a maturity in his voice as he spoke to the crowd. "I didn't ask for this to happen," he said, his words steady but heavy. "I didn't do anything wrong. But this happens all the time. Every day, People like me are seen as threats just because of how we look. His eyes scanned the crowd, and for a moment, it felt as if the weight of his words hung in the air. We shouldn't have to prove ourselves. We shouldn't have to fight just to be seen as human. The silence that followed was profound. Jordan's strength in this moment was undeniable, and it resonated with everyone who heard him. His words were a stark reminder of the emotional toll that racial profiling takes, not only on the individuals who experience it, but on the community as a whole. As the crowd absorbed Jordan's message, it was clear that the road ahead would be difficult, but this moment, this powerful reminder of humanity and justice, would be a catalyst for change. In the days following the incident at Oakwood Park, the community found itself in the midst of a difficult but necessary conversation. The shock of what had happened, an innocent teenager wrongfully accused and treated with suspicion based solely on his appearance, continued to echo in the streets, in homes, and at local businesses. Town halls were quickly organized, providing a space for residents to speak openly about their thoughts, frustrations, and hopes for change. The local newspaper ran multiple stories, with editorials urging the community to reflect on its biases. Public discussions about racial profiling and discrimination dominated the conversation, bringing difficult truths to the surface. Some voiced their anger over the way Jordan was treated, while others grappled with their own personal experiences of bias. The talks were tense at times, but they were also crucial for progress. The community was now forced to confront issues that had been quietly ignored for far too long. Amidst it all, Jordan, despite his youth, became an unexpected voice for change. Though he was still processing the traumatic events, he found himself at the center of a movement he never asked for. Jordan began sharing his story, speaking out at community meetings and school assemblies. His words, raw and honest, resonated deeply with those who heard them. It was clear that his experience was not isolated, it was part of a much larger issue. Jordan's bravery sparked important conversations about racial profiling, and slowly but surely, his story began to open hearts and minds. Mayor Olivia Thompson, while acknowledging the long road ahead, expressed hope for lasting change. In the weeks following the incident, she worked alongside community leaders to implement new policies aimed at reducing racial bias, including mandatory anti-bias training for law enforcement and educators. Though she knew that progress would be slow and that one incident couldn't change everything, she remained determined to create a lasting impact. The events at Oakwood Park, though painful, had become a pivotal moment for the community. It forced them to examine not just their past actions, but their future. And in that reflection, there was a glimmer of hope, a hope that change was possible if the conversation continued and if every voice, like Jordan's, was heard. As the day drew to a close, the weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. The events at Oakwood Park had sparked a conversation that was long overdue, but it was clear that true change would not come easily. Mayor Thompson and Jordan, walking side by side, knew the impact of their actions could lead to progress. However, both understood that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey. A journey that would require continued effort, honest dialogue, and the courage to confront bias in every corner of their community. As they walked away from the park, a quiet understanding passed between them. The road ahead would be challenging, but it was worth the fight. It wasn't just about one incident, it was about ensuring that future generations would not have to endure the same injustices. The message was clear: real change begins when we confront difficult truths, stand up for what is right, and refuse to let injustice go unchecked. It's a message for all of us, urging reflection and action. Only then can we begin to create a world where everyone feels safe and valued, no matter their skin color.